All right. So hopefully everyone now can see my screen. Is that correct? Can you nod and say you can see my screen? Perfect. All right. So welcome all to the first session of a series of presentations that I'm going to be giving about our Rubin family. And so when I talk about our Rubin family, this is Marie Landau's mother's family. And again, this is Grandpa Henry, Uncle Renee's grand their grandmother's family, their maternal grandmothers. So we're going to spend the next few weeks talking about this very, very large family that I have been researching for the last couple of years. The background here on the family is this was actually the last branch of the family that I researched from Grandpa Henry's ancestry. And there were reasons for that because I was involved for a while with many other lines of his ancestry, some of which we've talked about in the past, whether it be the Landau family, which there will be many more presentations to come about that family, because that is also a very interesting family, or the Metz family and the French ancestry, which we've talked about as well. But it was about a year into my research that I began researching the Rubin family, and it's really been wonderful being able to research it. And what we're going to discuss tonight is really what I term the immediate family. It's going to be a long presentation, but what we're going to be talking about are Marie Landau's aunts and uncles on her Rubin side, and her cousins and their descendants. And it was a big family. And the patriarch of the family, his name was Moses Rubin. That was Marie Landau's grandfather's name. And we're going to talk about him and about where he lived and his profession, and we'll talk about his descendants today. Next week, we're going to take up, after having this background about Moses Rubin, we're going to learn about Moses Rubin's siblings, which we know a lot about. And we might even get to Moses Rubin's aunts and uncles and their families, which again, we're going to be branching out further and further back in time. That's going to be next week on the 13th. On the 20th, we're going to sort of, we might finish up that second presentation. We might start there, but the core of the presentation is going to be a discussion about the rabbinic roots of the Rubin family, which was a really, really exciting discovery that takes this family back into the 18th century. And then finally, the last presentation, the fourth presentation in the series, which will be sometime over Thanksgiving weekend, will be a Y-DNA discussion of looking from a DNA perspective at the Rubin family and what we've been able to discover. And it is really interesting. And there will be some late-breaking news at that presentation. As over the next week or two, there should be some very exciting information on that front that we'll be learning about. All right, so without further ado, let's get started on Moses Rubin's family and his descendants, which is the topic of this first presentation. Let's see. All right, so here is a wonderful photo of our Rubin family, and it was taken in it was taken in around 1900, and I believe probably November of 1900, and this is probably the best. I don't know, this is the best encapsulation of this family because they were all together in this photo. But at this point in 1900, much of the family were living in different cities. Most likely, this picture was taken at the time that these two individuals were getting married, which was Moses Rubin's, one of his younger daughters, Regina, and her husband, who was David Gewirtz. And the reason why we think that is because this photo was in the possession of Regina's granddaughter, Ruth Almog, and she has this photo. This photo was taken in Tarnów, Poland, which is where Moses Rubin lived. And I just love this photo. You see all of his children. that all together in 1900, even some grandchildren and their spouse. Some of their spouses are there. And yeah, over here you have Moses Rubin, and for our ancestor, Marie Landau's mother, this is Helena Rubin Landau, which was her mother, and at quite a young age, in her 30s. What I also love about this photo are the mustaches of the men. They really, you can see the facial style is pretty interesting. And even like some of the younger children lying on the ground. I don't know. There's a lot of character to this picture, and we're going to be talking about a lot of the people in this picture over the course of this presentation. So, have this picture in mind. Again, this is Moses Rubin. This is actually his second wife. And again, this is our ancestor, Helena. So before I get started, I mentioned this at the outset before everyone was on, but this work and this presentation in particular has involved a lot of collaborative research, which is just absolutely wonderful. Two people in particular I really want to express gratitude towards. The first is Ruth Almog, who is Renee and Henry's second cousin, and she lives in Tel Aviv. And as I've mentioned again, I said it before and I'll say it again. She's a famous Israeli author. There is going to be a slide in this presentation devoted to her biography. But she has done incredible research on the Rubin family. And it was really when I first connected to her through Alan about 2.5 years ago that this research on the Rubin family really took off. So it's really been amazing being able to work with her. And she has written quite a bit about our family too, which I will mention. And then second is a very dear cousin who I've connected with over the last couple years. Her name is Ann Terrius. She's my father's third cousin. And we will talk about her line of the family. But she has researched her branch of the family pretty extensively. And a lot of the information about her family and her branch of the family comes from her. So I really want to thank both of these two individuals. And, it's always amazing when you can connect with family members who love the genealogy research and you connect. And, Anne is a really special story because what we found in our research is our two families were very close, not all that long ago. And, the fact that we were able to reconnect and collaborate on this is really wonderful. All right, so now we're going to get started in talking about our ancestor, Moses Rubin, who is my third great-grandfather. And for other people on the call, their second great-grandfather. So what do we know about his life? And again, we're going to return to him and his family next week too, because we're going to be talking about his brothers and sisters. But he was born in a small town in southeastern Poland today, then part of Galicia, which was a province of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And the town was called Korczyn, or Korczyn. We know that he was the oldest of 6 surviving children, and we know his parents' names. He was the son of a man named Menachem Mendel Rubin, and his mother's name was Mendel Rechel Teitelbaum. As I said, we're going to be talking about a lot of this earlier ancestry in the next couple weeks, but just keep in mind those were his parents' names. So while he was born in the town of Korczyn, which is where his Rubin family was from, they moved to another town, Sambir, Ukraine today. It was called Sambor. It's it also part of Galicia, but again, it's part of Western Ukraine today. And they lived there for about 10 years, and then they settled in Tarnów. Which is in southern Poland, also in Galicia, in the late 1850s. And then Moses Rubin, he lived in Tarnów the rest of his life. So he basically lived in 3 cities during the course of his life. And Ruth Almog, having talked to a lot of family members, she had this oral tradition that Moses was a very wealthy man. He was respected in the community. He had this nickname of being a gevir, which was like an important, wealthy man, and that he had a carriage with gray horses, a big house with a closed garden. So this was the oral tradition that Ruth Almog had told me. And we'll see that a lot of this is going to be corroborated by the research that he was, in fact, a wealthy man. And so Moses married a woman named Marchem, which is Miriam Prager. And in fact, Marie Landau is named after her, after Moses' wife, Marchem. And she was from another town in Galicia called Novi Visnich. It was called Visnich back then. And they had 9 surviving children. So what we're going to discuss in this presentation are these 9 children and what happened to these lines of the family. And what's wonderful here, again, we have this picture of Moses Rubin over here in the right-hand side. Here is actually a drawing after her death. It must be from an existing picture or portrait of her that a man named Jack Rubin painted. We're going to talk about Jack Rubin next week. He's a very famous cousin from the extended Rubin family. And this portrait actually hangs in Ruth Almog's apartment. It's really beautiful. And it was painted probably a couple years after her death. It's dated to around 1900. All right, so I have here, this is a quick slide, just to show a map of where we're talking about here. So number 4 is where Marchem Prager was from, Moses' wife. 1 is where Cortina is. That's where Moses Rubin was born. So 1 and 4 is where he and his wife were from. 2 is Sambir. This is where he lived in his childhood for a number of years. And then 3 is Tarnov. And that's where he lived for 40 plus years of his life. All right. So what do we know about the Rubin family business and the occupation? Well, we actually know quite a bit. He, and what we'll find is a lot of people in his family were involved in a wholesale egg distribution business where they would transport eggs from Eastern Europe to markets in Western and Central Europe. And we know that not only was Moses Rubin involved in this trade, which you can see down here. This is a list in 1891, his business directory. It talks about he paid a lot of money actually to be in this business directory, but it shows that he was in this business. But we also have an 1881 legal marriage record. I won't go into the specifics why this record is so much later after he got married, but this is a not uncommon thing in Galicia to have a legal marriage record that happened well after the religious marriage. But here you have a really wonderful record because it mentions the hometown of Cortina. It mentions his occupation here, which in Polish, this says that he is an egg trader. And it mentions his parents' names, Mendel Rubin and Mindel Teitelbaum, and Mendel Rubin also is in this egg business. So it's a really wonderful document that sort of summarizes the occupation, the hometown, and and again what the parents did, what the father did too. So this was a family business. What I next wanted to do here is I was able to really make some inroads on figuring out where Moses Rubin lived in Tarnov. So we know the town that he lived in, but I was able to figure out the exact address and exact area of the city that he was living in. So what you're seeing here in this middle part is an address book in 1884 for Tarnov, for the city of Tarnov. And what it lists here are homes and who the owners of the homes are. And for most people who lived in Tarnov, and especially most Jews who lived in Tarnov, they're not in this list. Because in order to be involved in this list, you had to be a home owner. And most people were renters. Most Jews were renters and could not afford home ownership. Moses Rubin was an exception. Not only did he own a home, he actually owned 2 buildings. And what's wonderful here is that you have a translation between what you find in the civil records, which is just a random number, and a district. So here you can see this number is 43-44 and 45 in the Zavale district. It actually corresponds to a specific street name. And those street names still exist today in Tarnov. And so where did he live? He lived on Ulica. Ulica just means street in Polish. Szpitana. Szpitana in Polish means hospital. So it was Hospital Street. And on further north on this street, the main hospital in Tarnov was on this street. So that's where the origin of the name. But we actually have specific addresses. And here we know it's 4 and 6 on Spitalna Street, which is really amazing. And we actually know from all these civil records that for over 20 years, probably more, Moses Rubin was living in these residences. And not only that, but at various times, different extended family members would be living in these homes. So it wasn't just his family, but he owned the house. Moses was clearly one of the wealthier ones, and he owned the property, but other Rubin family members lived in there, including our ancestor Helena Rubin. She was living there in the late 1880s after she was married. So the history about this address, I'm gonna show a better map now on the next page. But this area that this home was in was later in the Tarnów ghetto, which is pictured over here on the left-hand side in this yellow box. This is Spitalna right here, and in between Lwowska and this other street up here onto the north is the address that the Moses Rubin's home lived in. So as a result of the war, all of the homes in the ghetto were destroyed and rebuilt after the war. So the area looks completely different than what it used to look like. But what I want to show on this next page here is an old map of Tarnów, where you can get a sense for just what existed and get a sense of the layout here. And so what I've done here is, some of you may have been to Tarnów, like myself, and might recognize the city center, the city square called the Rynek. Rynek is Polish for like market and center area. If you've been to Tarnów, you've definitely seen that. And if you've been to Tarnów, you will also know the Bima, which is the old synagogue, the remnants of the old synagogue, which all that is left of the synagogue is the Bima from the synagogue. And it's a major landmark, Jewish landmark in the town. So I cite where that is. It's right near the Rynek. And where Moses Rubin's family lived is in these buildings here. It had a courtyard, which again, that was something that Ruth Almag had talked about, and these were big residences along right outside the city center district. It was probably about a 10-minute walk to the Bima, a 10 to 15-minute walk to the Rynek. This is actually just a map of the city center. There were Jews living much further out in this area called Krabowka, and also further out in Zawale. But we actually have this old map, and we actually can pinpoint exactly where he lived and where our family was living on this map. And again, these streets still exist, but the area looks very different now after the war. All right, so I also want to touch briefly here. We're going to look at this more next week and less so this week, but a lot of the family graves in Tarnów still exist and are still standing today. It is not one of those cemeteries that was destroyed by the Nazis, thank goodness, because we have so many ancestors that are buried in this cemetery. Some of them are defaced in terms of their the Hebrew epitaphs, but some are very easily read. What I would say is, if anyone wants to assist me, I was able to, earlier this year, to get very high quality photos taken of a lot of these graves. I befriended a Polish man who went to the Tarnów Cemetery on my behalf and took high quality photos. Some of them you'll see in next week's presentation, but you see a couple here as well, which is Moses Rubin's grave here. This is his wife, Miriam Marhem. This is her grave. And then these are Moses' parents' graves, Menachem Mendel and Mindel. But I really would like some help from someone who has good eyes and can help with poetic Hebrew, because Moses Rubin's inscription is very hard to read. So if anyone is interested in helping me with transcribing, and then maybe helping with a translation of his grave, that would be greatly appreciated, because that's been a tough nut to crack. But all these graves are still standing, and some of them were just photographed earlier this year. All right, so now we're going to get into the meat of the presentation. We're going to talk about all of Moses Rubin's children and what we know a little bit about their families and their descendants. Some families we're going to go into a little bit more depth than others. So Moses and Marham, they had 10 children. Their oldest daughter died as an infant, and that was not uncommon to have children die in infancy or childhood. That was very common, but they only had one that died as an infant. 9 survived childhood, and we're going to talk about those 9. And what I posted here are the ancestors of the 2 people who I corroborated with. So Antarius's ancestor is from the second child, but the first that we're going to really talk about, Jacob Rubin. We're going to talk a lot about his family because there's a lot that we know about his family. Obviously, we descend from the next child, Helena Rubin, who was married to Alexander Landau. And we go through the line. There's Leah Irvin, who was born David, Joseph Leib, Adel, Wilhelm, who was born Wolf, Regina, who was born Rebecca, and then Samuel, who had the nickname Munio. So we're going to go through all these children. There are going to be some slides. The first half of the children, we're going to go into more depth than the latter half. But I really want you to get a sense for how big this family was and just all the interesting stories that came out of this family and the descendants. And again, as early as in 1900, all the family was together for that wedding. So that wasn't all that long ago. All right. So even though Moses Rubin lived in Tarnov, his children spread out, and many were not living in Tarnov. So those 9 children that survived childhood, they settled in a few different cities, all German speaking. So the first 3 children settled in Leipzig. Jacob, who we're going to talk about first, Helena, our ancestor, and Lotte Rubin Datner. They all were in Leipzig. The first 3 children, the eldest 3, were in Leipzig. The next one, David, he settled in Vienna. Joseph Rubin was in Berlin for a time, and then he settled in Dusseldorf in Western Germany. Adel was in Elberfeld, which is also near Dusseldorf in Western Germany. Regina was in Chemnitz, which is in Eastern Germany, and Wilhelm, he stayed in Tarnov. So we'll talk about all these children, but what you have here is a map. By the early 20th century, where were our Rubin? This is all of Marie Landau's aunts and uncles. Where were they? Well, again, some were still in Tarnov, but you can see the map here. Here, number 2 is Leipzig. Over here is Vienna. We've got Berlin, Dusseldorf, and Elberfeld here. Chemnitz is over here. So Eastern Germany, Western Germany, and Vienna. All right. So now we're going to start with the first surviving child, Jacob Rubin, who was born Yechiel. And we're going to talk about his life and his children. And he is a really important person to talk about because he was born, again, in 1865. He got married to a woman named Ida Medlinger, but he continued the family business that his father had been in and his grandfather had been in. And in fact, he was the business partner of our ancestor, Alexander Landau, who was his brother-in-law. And they had a wholesale egg distribution business that they ran together that they called Rubin and Landau. So we now know why it was called Rubin and Landau. It was because it was run by Jacob Rubin and his brother-in-law, Alexander Landau. And Alexander Landau got into the business because of his father-in-law. It was the Rubin family business that he got into. And he subsequently got some of his siblings involved in the egg business. But again, this was a business that originated in the Rubin family. Jacob and Ida, they had 4 children. We're going to talk about each of them because, again, this is something that Antarius, who's a descendant of Jacob, she's done a lot of research in. So they had one son named Lota, and then they had 3 daughters, Minna, Rosa, and Kath Marie. And again, Kath Marie is also named after Miriam, just like our ancestor Marie Landau. You'll see that recurring theme. You'll see the common names. Minna is named after Mindel, which was Moses' mother. And again, I love this picture of Jacob and his wife. Again, you get a really good picture of what he looked like with the mustache and everything. All right, so now we're going to go into his children and what we know about Jacob's children. So Lota Rubin was pretty fascinating. He actually immigrated to the United States and lived in the United States. So before then, though, I learned that Lota was a professional soccer player. He played on the Leipzig team, the German Leipzig soccer team. And that was a team that won the championship in their region twice and a Central German championship once. And in 1911, Lota participated in the German championship soccer game, in which Leipzig did not win. They lost that one to Dresden. But he was like a very skilled soccer player, and he loved soccer the rest of his life. So the story is, so he was in that, he played between 1909 and 1911. Family lore says that he stole from the Rubin and Landau business. He stole from his father's business. And basically his father sent him away and helped pay for his ticket and said, "You're out of here." And before World War I, just before World War I, he arrived in the United States. So in the United States, he first worked in New York as a furrier, and then he was a wholesaler in an egg business, a butter and egg business for many years. He then moved to Chicago and to Los Angeles. And Lota has no descendants today. He did not have any of his own children. But just thought that, again, these is just the first of a lot of stories we're going to talk about. And just, with every subsequent story, it's like, oh my goodness, like, I can't believe I didn't know about any of these people beforehand. But he was the one son that Jacob had. The eldest daughter, the second child of Jacob, her name was Minna Rubin Hartel. She was born in Leipzig, and she married a man in Leipzig. They had one daughter named Margot. And in 1938, as a result of everything going on in Germany, she moved to Paris. And her daughter had already moved there. So, unfortunately, she died in the Shoah. And she was caught up in probably one of the most famous roundups in the French part of the war. In July of 1942, 13,000 Jews were arrested in Paris. It's called the Veldiv Roundup. And she was one of those who was rounded up in that point. And almost all of the Jews there were murdered in Auschwitz. She went to Drancy camp, which was a transit camp outside of Paris, and sent to Auschwitz in August of 1942. It's still a bit of a mystery, but her husband survived. He was penniless. And her daughter also survived. They did not get rounded up. And so her daughter and their descendants still live in France today. This has been a challenge to connect with the descendants of this family, because they want nothing to do with connecting with any of this stuff. But we do know their names, and her descendants still live today, even though Minna died in Auschwitz. And this is a picture of her with her granddaughter in the 1930s. The other daughter, the second daughter, was Rosa Rubin Klepetar, and she also died in the Shoah. So she was born in Leipzig, but she did not live in Leipzig. She married a Czech doctor named Hans Klepetar, and they had one son who was born in Leipzig, but they moved to Prague, and they lived in Prague. Really remarkably, Rosa fought for her son to leave Prague and to get out of Europe. And she was successfully able to get him to travel to the United States, where the son's name was Manfred, where his uncle Lota was living. She was able to get him to the United States. And she actually wrote a lot of letters to her son during the war. They've been published in French with a French translation, which I have the book. And others who are interested, I'm sure they can get sent copies too, of letters that Rosa wrote to her son in America, and how she really expresses just how grateful she was that he was able to get out. And why wasn't she or her husband able to? Well, her husband was very sick. Hans was very sick at the time, and they could not leave Prague. They were basically stuck there. So Hans died in 1940, and in 1942, Rosa was transported from Prague to Terezin, which is outside of Prague. It was a camp, a concentration camp, and then she was later, just a few days later, sent to most likely Sobibor, where she was murdered. So we have this wonderful picture of Rosa and her husband. But Rosa's son, again, he was able to make it out. He lives in America. He was first in New York, then he went to Chicago, and then eventually Los Angeles. And Manfred's son, Ron Klepetar, is someone I've been in contact with. He still lives in Los Angeles today. He has some children and grandchildren. And then the last child of Jacob Rubin is Kath Marie Rubin Fourier. And she was born in 1903. She was married twice. She first married a Hungarian Jew named Irvin Schatz, and they had one daughter named Monica, who we're going to talk about shortly, who was born in 1928. She then divorced this man, Irvin, who was not a great guy from all accounts, and she married a Frenchman in 1935, a non-Jewish Frenchman named Georges Fourier, and they had one other daughter named Marita, born in 1937. Marita is Anne Terrius's mother. And so she is the granddaughter of Kath, and she actually knew Kath as a child. So just a little bit of background on her. She was able to survive the war, Kath. She was in a town called Beauvoir, and then later she moved to the Vichy regime in Nice, and they basically, it was very tough living there where food was scarce, but they were not targeted, for being Jewish. And she was able to survive, along with Jacob's wife, Ida. She also was able to survive the war, and she died shortly after the war in 1945. And then, again, all of Kath's descendants today live in France, including, as I said, Anne Terrius, who I've gotten the chance to meet already 2 times in person, and who lives in France. So I mentioned... so I guess maybe I should stop. Maybe I should just go back here and just say, Kath was living in a next door apartment to our family in Leipzig during the 1920s and 1930s, and that's what made connecting with this branch of the family so special. They actually co-owned the apartments at 31 Springerstrasse together, and Monica, who we're going to talk about in the next slide, was just a couple years younger than Renee. She was just a few months younger than Henry, and they lived in next-door apartments for the first 6 to 7 years of their lives. She does not remember anyone from the family because of her memory. Her memory isn't great from her early years. But literally, our families were very tight and very close, and they co-owned apartments, and they were living next door to each other as late as the mid-1930s. So I want to spend a slide on Monica because she's just a fascinating woman. And today is her birthday, actually. She just turned 94 today and doing very well. So Monica, she's the daughter from the first marriage, born in 1928 in Leipzig. She, with her family, moved to France and survived the war. And her life was definitely dominated by her history in the Communist Party. Okay, I'm getting a question from Alan here about were they connected in Nice? That's a great question. I don't think so. Because they weren't in Nice until later in the war. Whereas our family was in Nice between 1937 and 1939 before the war. So I don't know if they were. I don't think they were connected in Nice. Okay, feel free to keep on asking questions or to stop me. So getting back to Monica, she joined the Communist Party in France in 1949. There were all these stories about the communist heroic behavior in the Buchenwald concentration camp and their activist work. So her life has been as an active communist. She married a French communist named Noël Decour, and in 1958, they moved to Morocco. And so she was involved in a lot of the history of the Algerian War for Independence. First, she signed a famous petition calling for the independence of Algeria, and she hid 2 Algerians who were, considered, terrorists basically by the right-wing French dissident paramilitary organization. So she basically helped with rebels against the French military organization. And she even, in addition to that, she collected medicine from French doctors to treat the wounded who came, to Morocco from Algeria. And she met so many famous people from the Moroccan Communist Party during that time. So it was really like very, very interesting time in history that she was very involved in. She then was that she was in Morocco for 5 years. In 1963, she returned to France. She later divorced and later remarried, and she's been active in the local Communist Party in France till today. Which again, the Communist Party is more substantial in France than obviously that it exists in the United States. And in addition to all of her activism, she's a dog breeder, and she continues to be a dog breeder today. She's bred over 350 French Shepherd dogs, including one that became a U.S. champion, which is really cool. And she also now breeds Persian cats. So if you follow her on Facebook, she will post about her dogs and her cats that she breeds. And she's a very lively 94-year-old woman in very good health. So hopefully that will continue for many more years to come. So that concludes the first child. That was a big section. I know that was going to be a big section. Not every child is going to be this long. But because we have so much information and it was very interesting, I wanted to relate that. What we're next going to talk about is our branch of the family, which I do want to spend a little bit of time on as well, even though this is going to be a bit more familiar to some of us. So Helena was the second surviving child. She was born in 1867, and she married in 1886 Alexander Landau, who was from another Galician town called Novi Sad, or Sans in Yiddish. And then they moved to Leipzig by the early 1890s. And probably the first surprise that I had, that was a more recent surprise, is they actually had 4 children. I don't know if anyone else knew of this. Maybe this is just new to me, but I had always thought that they had 3 children, but they actually had an older daughter who died in her 20s named Minna, who was born in 1887, and her grave is in Leipzig today. And then they had 3 other children who are more well known: Siegfried, Marie, which is my great grandmother, and Hildegard. And so Alexander Landau, as we said, he worked in this Rubin and Landau egg business. They were the 2 partners. He and his brother-in-law Jacob Rubin, they were in this egg business in Leipzig. And this is a great picture that I have courtesy of Alan. If anyone has pictures of Alexander Landau and Helena Rubin and have any other pictures of them, I would love to see them. This is the only picture I have of Alexander Landau, so it's really really wonderful to see them. And you can see they were of the upper middle class, which is what Renee had always told me. So we're going to go through the 3 surviving children, a little bit about their lives, because some of this might not be new to everyone here, but I think it's important to talk about. So Siegfried was the oldest surviving child and the only son of Helena, and he married a woman named Margaret Benjamin, and they had 1 daughter, Helga, who died of scarlet fever as a teenager. And so they actually do not have any surviving descendants today. Siegfried became a lawyer in Leipzig. And what I have pictured here, this is something that Uncle Rene donated to the Leo Baeck Institute. You can find this online too. He was disbarred as a lawyer in 1933. And subsequently, he actually moved to Prague. He left Leipzig. He moved to Prague and completely moved into a different line of business. He was a lawyer for the first decade or so. And then he became sort of an entrepreneur. He ran a laundry business with a former law partner of his named Adolf Lippmann. In 1939, he was also very fortunate to be able to leave Europe. He moved to Santiago, Chile. And there, he was also a successful entrepreneur. He participated in several industrial companies. He became a co-owner of a glassware factory in Chile called Favima. That glass factory still exists today. And he was also significantly invested in Jewish life. He was the president of a congregation called B'nai Israel, and he was a member of the Council of Jews from Germany. So he lived a very active life. I think I got a little bit of time. I can share a brief story that I found about Siegfried that I thought was just really interesting because it just gives some color to his life. In 1922, he was living in Leipzig, and he was a lawyer then. And the reason we know this is because of some court documents that someone was digging around and found and wrote about online about it. But he would bike to work. He had a bike, and he would bike to work, but his office was on the 3rd floor of a building. So he would park his bike at his at his father's business, Alexander Landau's business, which was in the central district of Leipzig. He would park his bike there, and then he would go to his office. So he was planning to meet up with a man to go bike riding after his day of work, and he went to his father's office, the Rubin and Landau egg business. He was there in the office getting his bike, and a woman comes in, and she starts saying, "Can I buy some eggs?" And he explains to her, he's like, "Hey, first of all, it's not my business, and it's my father's business, but we only we're a wholesale distributor. We don't sell to individuals, and we sell to grocery stores, we sell to other places, but we're not selling to you." And she's like, but I need to buy 200 or 300 eggs. Like, I need to buy them now. And he's like, "Sorry, we don't sell to individuals. We're not going to sell them." And then she starts inquiring from him. She's like, "Who are you? Like, what? Like, who are you?" And she's like, "Well, I'm a lawyer." And so then she starts berating him and insulting him and saying, "Oh, you're a lawyer? What are you doing selling eggs?" And he's not selling eggs because he's not selling to her. But anyways, she's berating him and whatnot. Nothing of the remarks are anti-Semitic, by the way. They're just she's just an older woman who's just arguing with him. And then he decides, because he feels like his name is getting, she's basically causing a big stir in the market. So, and, accusing him of, just, being a know-nothing or whatever, that he wants to bring her to the police and get her name because she won't reveal her name. So she starts running away. He takes his bike and he tracks her down, and he gets her name or whatever, and he tries to file a defamation case against her, against this woman. And what's interesting is, in German law, there isn't the same level of freedom of speech that exists in the United States. If you defame someone's character, you can be sued in court and fined by the court if you're defaming someone's character. And he tried to do that, and the court did not give him anything. They just withdrew the petition. But it's a really funny incident about Siegfried's life. And what's also very interesting is, who was the person he was going to go on a bike ride with? He was also a very famous person. He became the chief police officer of Leipzig later on in the decade. He was very anti-fascist, and he was immediately let go in 1933. He fled the country. He later came back. He was not Jewish, but this guy came back to Germany after the war, and he became a federal court judge. In Western Germany. So this guy was, Siegfried was connected to some people who were pretty high up in Leipzig society, and again, anti-fascist, obviously.
Jeremy?
Yes.
Just one note. Our house in the Berkshires, we live walking distance to a guy called Claudio Pinchas. Alan knows him. He was a member of that congregation in Chile, and Siegfried was the president when he had his bar mitzvah. He gave me a picture of Siegfried that he had.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
And he was very fond of him, and it was a whole thing. And then in the day school I'm working at now, one of the grandparents, one of the kids in the day school, is a board member of that same shul.
Oh my gosh. So the shul still exists today.
I met her in Israel, and she was talking about the shul, and she was talking about, the history of the shul, and, she knew of him because his picture is in the shul.
Oh my gosh. If you can send me that picture, if you have a digital copy of that image, I would love to see a later photo.
Yeah, I think I took a picture of it, so I can send it to you.
Okay, great. That's a great story. So there's some good stories about Siegfried, and about his investment in the Jewish community, and just some of the stories here that I just mentioned about his earlier life when he was younger. So the next child, again, is my great-grandmother, some of your grandmothers, Marie Landau Lehmann. So again, this slide I basically put up for other family members, more distant family members who don't know about her. But our family, obviously, we went to Nice, and then Sao Paulo, and then New Orleans between 1937 and 1941. But we'll just leave it there. If anyone has a better picture of Marie Landau too, I don't have many good pictures of her. Please send them my way too, because I would love to be able to see them and put them on the tree. And last but not least, we're going to talk about Hildegard, who was also known as Hilda or Hia, more with her family, her close family members, who she died in the Shoah. She's the closest family member to us in any of Grandpa Henry's side to have died in the Shoah. And as I've talked about in the past, I will hopefully be putting together a book about her life. But I wanted to write just a brief summary here on this slide. So she was actually a teacher in Leipzig. We had actually found a really wonderful picture of her as a teacher in a school in Leipzig in the 1920s, which was really interesting. But then she worked. She moved to Brussels, and she received a PhD in studying the works of a Belgian writer and poet. I actually have her thesis. You can actually buy it online. It was published in Paris in the 1930s, and you can buy. There are plenty of copies online that you can find and purchase. It's in French, but and it's again about a it's a it's a work about it's more like literature and also philosophy of a Belgian writer. But she was very, very, the fact that she was able to receive her doctorate was she was very highly well educated. So she was living. Well, we know actually a lot about what happened afterwards. She was in Belgium. She fled to France when the Nazis invaded Belgium in May of 1940, and the French held her in Gurs internment camp, which was in southwestern France along the Spanish border. When the Nazis took over France and took over Free France, basically the prison guards at Gurs burned everything of all of their people before they handed over the camp to the Nazis. They burned everything and said, "Run away, like just leave, get out of here." And that's what she did, which was it worked to her detriment too, because we actually have a letter later in the war writing to the Gurs camp owned by the Nazis. She actually writes a letter to the Gurs camp asking for records of her internment there, and they're like, "We don't have anything. Everything was burned." And she needed that in order to get a visa to come to the United States, which is really sad. So she lived in unoccupied France, the Vichy regime, for a couple of years, living in Marseille and then near Nice. And in the fall of 1942, the Nazis basically were invading the Vichy France and taking over all those areas. And so she, along with a lot of other Jewish refugees, tried to escape into Switzerland. And Switzerland was notorious for, if you read anything about its history, about not letting Jews into the neutral country, and basically turning these refugees back to the French/Nazis. And Hilda was a victim of that. But her story, we were able to dig a little deeper and learn a lot more about her life. She and her last days. We know that she actually tried to escape into Switzerland by taking a boat along with a few other Jewish refugees from a town in France over Lake Geneva, which is actually called Lac Léman in French, to go over Lake Geneva and to get into Switzerland. And the second that she and her refugees and the other refugees on the boat landed in Switzerland, they were arrested. And she was handed over back to the French officials, where she had a stay in a few different camps over the course of a month before she was sent to Auschwitz and she died. What's pretty amazing about her life is we've been in touch, both me and Anne, we've been in touch with a Swiss historian who is the expert of Jewish refugees in Switzerland. And she's actually written about Hilda. Why? Because she is the only Jew to have crossed over Lake Geneva to have died in the Holocaust. Every other one who did this route of travel was successful in getting into Switzerland or getting interned back in France, but surviving the war. And Hilda is the only one to have perished, which is a really remarkable statistic about how tragic her life was. And the other thing is we have letters from Hilda to our family that was sent to Marie. And I didn't realize it at first until we uncovered the story. But her final letter to our family is after she was captured. And she writes a farewell letter to her family that's very emotional. And she says, "I'm on the train." And what she means by that is she had been captured and she was being sent to an internment camp in France after being captured and being handed over to the French and then the Nazis. So there's a lot that we have a lot of letters from her that we want to publish with an English translation and a French translation. And again, there's a lot more to the story. Like we even know about the fisherman who sold his boat. He got prosecuted by the French, and we know about his life. And he served a month in prison for selling his boat to the Jewish refugees. So there's just so much more information that we know about the last, her attempted escape into Switzerland.
Did she come to the States for the World Fair? Was that in the 30s and then went back?
And they wanted her to stay. She didn't.
She did come. That's also part of the tragic part of her history is that she came to America, to New York City, in March of 1939. And she was on a 3-month visa. And people told her, just stay. Do not go back to Europe. Just stay. Like, overstay your visa. Like, who cares? And she was a rule follower. It was very clear that she followed the rules. Like, you can just see by her letters that she was timid and did not want to break any rules. And so she went back to Belgium, and that was a huge mistake because then she was stuck. She tried corresponding with U.S. officials. She had a boat ticket from Portugal during the war, from France. She had a boat ticket from Portugal to America. She was not able to leave France and get out of France. It's just heartbreaking. And the U.S. Embassy is well known also for its efforts to stymie refugees, Jewish refugees, from getting visas. I've just been reading about it recently too. The U.S. is certainly to blame for this too. All right, we did the first 2 children. This one is going to be a lot faster. And so, again, not all of them are going to be this long, but I do want to be able to talk about our family. So the third child was Lotte Rubin Datner. She also was in Leipzig. She married a man named Abraham Datner. They had 2 sons. You can see these 2 sons from the 1900 picture, Herman and Leon. Leon, I don't know much about Herman's life. Leon was actually able to escape Europe and go to England in 1939, but his wife and children all died. And so he was really, it took an emotional toll on his life. But Ruth Almog actually got to meet Leon. He was sort of he knew so much about the history of the family. And she's even written a chapter about Leon called Leon and the Professor, which for anyone who's interested, I'm happy to send her piece about Leon and her impressions of him. But again, Leon was Lotte's son. And Leon was Marie Landau's first cousin. And so what I have here is a summary picture of I've been able to find where people lived and where the businesses were in Leipzig, and just giving a sense of the map. So in this brown here, this is Lotte Rubin, her family and her businesses. We've got here some businesses of all the families, the Datner family. This is where the central district, where the egg business was. It's right in the market, in the central area. Some of our family, Alexander Landau lived over here in the blue, and then our family in the 1920s and 1930s lived up here to the north. This is where 31 Springer Strasse was. I think it's nice to be able to see a map and see where everything is located. And then I have here, I had sent this around to some family members before. We can try to play this video. I'm not sure how well it's going to play on a Zoom setting, but I found this remarkable video not too long ago of a streetcar dash cam from 1931 of the city of Leipzig. And basically this was filmed at the front of a streetcar to help train conductors the paths of the streetcars in Leipzig. And this is just before the Nazis took power. And what you see here is just a very vibrant life in Leipzig. You see people walking, you see people biking, you see the trams, you see horse and buggies. Yeah, maybe I'll wait to show the video until later because it probably is not going to show well. But you see, you just see life in Leipzig, and again, this city was very beautiful. It 2/3 of the city was destroyed by a bombing, by Allied bombing during the war. It looks very different today. And you just get a sense. Also, you see all these bikers, and then the Siegfried Landau story about him going on a bike ride just takes on a whole nother dimension when you see all these bikers in this video. So I have two slides where I have short videos. Basically, they're around the central district. This is very, very close to where our Landau Rubin family members were working in their business and where they were walking every day or biking every day to and from work. So you can just get a sense for it. I think for just because we're already running, we've already spent a lot of time so far. I think we'll skip the videos, but I will send out the link. It will also be in the YouTube video and of the presentation. And I think watching it on your own will be great for everyone. So I have two slides where I have some short video clips, and you can see the whole video online too at this link that I have. Okay. All right. So now we're going to get to the fourth child. His name was David Rubin. He changed it to Irvin. And so he married a woman named Augusta Maschler in Krakow in 1901. And then they moved to Vienna. This was the son that moved to Vienna. And this was our Viennese family from this part of the Rubin family. And he was a senior finance official in Vienna. And he had two children, Marcel, who was born in 1905, and Olga Maria. Again, the Maria name is named after Marchem Prager, which was Moses Rubin's wife, born in 1907. So Irvin's first wife died, and he married her younger sister. That's something that you sometimes see in genealogy too, is that that happened where you would marry two sisters after the first sister died. And so what happened to Irvin after the Anschluss, which is when the Germans took over Vienna in March of 1938, he was able to successfully escape Austria. And he first was in France, and then he later moved to Mexico with his son Marcel during the war. He came back to Europe and died in France in 1947. So this is a picture of Irvin from 1930. So I want to talk a little bit about his children because they are famous and well known. So Marcel Rubin, which was Irvin's son, he was a very famous Austrian composer. So I talk about who he studied with. He emigrated to Paris for a number of years and studied composition in Paris as well before returning to Vienna. He with his father fled to France at first, and then he and his father went to Mexico. And in Mexico, he was the musical director of the Mexico City Opera during World War II. And he also was an accompanist and conductor. He returned to Vienna in 1947 and lived in Vienna the remainder of his life and did a lot of and was a composer in Vienna for many decades subsequently. So he composed 10 symphonies and an opera. You can hear some of his music, played online, and he won many awards in Austria for his musical compositions. I mean, he is one of the most famous Austrian composers of the 20th century. And he's a cousin of ours. He was Marie Landau's first cousin. Okay. The other, and he doesn't have any children. He has no surviving descendants today. Olga Maria was the other child of Irvin, and she was a painter and an artist. She also was very creative. She was born in Vienna, and then she married a French musicologist named Marcel Bouffi, and she converted to Catholicism. And in fact, she became a very religious Catholic. And she hid her Jewish ancestry from her children and descendants and would not talk about it at all. So Olga's artwork and paintings were exhibited across Europe during her lifetime, and some of her tapestries are actually in a museum in Vienna today. So you can actually see some of her artwork today. And I've actually had the chance to connect with her descendants today, which has been very nice. It was a real surprise for them to find out about their Jewish ancestry. Some of them have taken it, some of them, I think it's really shocked them. Ruth also had the chance to meet Olga when she was in her later years, and she wrote about it. And it seems like that she had a troubled she was troubled by all of it. And I actually owe a personal debt of gratitude to Olga because even though she converted to Catholicism, she, after the war, was very connected to our family. And she wrote a very important letter in 1945 to Ruth Almog's grandmother, where she talks about the family. And from that 1945 letter, it was that letter that allowed me to connect with that whole family in France of Jacob Rubin's descendants. And there's no way I would have been able to connect without Olga's letter. So I feel very connected to her for helping me with my genealogy research. And her descendants live in France today. So her descendants send me some photos, some wonderful pictures of the family from early in life. Clearly, they were very well off in Vienna. You can see this is Olga and her brother Marcel in 1910. And this is Olga in 1931. And this is Olga with her husband Marcel in 1938. And I have links about her husband, who again, Olga's husband was very famous. So now we're moving on to, this is going to be relatively short too, child number 5, Joseph Leib Rubin. And he married a woman named Rosa Goldschmidt in a town in Germany. They had 2 sons, Max and Hans. Hans married someone outside of the Jewish faith that, from what we've heard, from what I've heard from the other side of the story, that broke his mother's heart, and she died early in 1927, the mother, Rosa. And Max and Hans had a falling out. What we know about Hans, the one who married a non-Jew, he fled to Barcelona during the war, but apparently he returned to Germany. I was able to find a death record for him, but I know nothing about Hans's descendants so far. But I do know a bit about Max, and we're going to talk about Joseph's son's Max, who again was Marie's first cousin. So he was a bachelor for most of his life. The story that I heard from his step-descendants is in 1920 he was the German champion on the Harley-Davidson motorcycle, and was, he was a bachelor. Just he was athletic and whatnot. He moved to Amsterdam after the Nazis took power, and that's where he was living. So, really remarkably, Max survived the Shoah. I can't explain it for why he did, because he was so old. He was born in 1900 and he was in his mid-40s at the time that all this happened. But I was able to find some records about where he was, which camps he was in. Westerbork, Bergen-Belsen, Terezin, and then Auschwitz. And he got to Auschwitz in September 1944, so it was pretty close to the end of the war and just a few months before Auschwitz was liberated. But somehow he was able to survive. He was a bachelor again. Before the war, he met a woman named Berta Rubinstein, who had a son named Herbert. And Berta, again, had lost her husband. And so he married Berta and adopted Herbert as his adopted son. And I talk a little bit about his life in Amsterdam. He basically worked in the fashion business. He had a small factory. He did ladies' belts, buttons, decorations for female garments. And then in the mid-1950s, he moved from Amsterdam back to Germany. He actually moved to Dusseldorf. And his step-descendants are still in Dusseldorf today, and they're very prominent members of the Jewish community. So Herbert is still alive, the stepson. And he served as the executive board of the Jewish community for more than 35 years. And Herbert's son, Michael Rubinstein, is now the administrative director of the Dusseldorf Jewish community. He took on that role back in 2020. And I've had the chance to connect with both Herbert and Michael. And that's how I've been able to get some of these stories about Max Rubin's life, which is really remarkable to be able to connect with them. All right, we're going to keep going. And we're on child 6, Adel Rubin Tisch. So she was born in 1871. This branch of the family was in Western Germany. She married a man named Leo Tisch, who was a merchant. And they had 3 children, which you can see in this beautiful picture here. This is Leo, this is Adel, and their 3 children. Marie, again, named after Moses' wife. And Clara in the middle here, and Gerda. And there are no living descendants from this branch today because all three of the children were perished in the Shoah. But this is the Tish family. In 1918, they were sent to Minsk, to the ghetto there, and they died probably in 1942 or 1943. But I've got another slide on this family because, yet again, we have another famous cousin of Marie Landau from this family. And that's the middle daughter over here, Clara Tisch. So she was the middle daughter, and she was a very famous German economist. So I talk about where she studied in her studies. But one of her teachers was Joseph Schumpeter, who's a very famous economist from the 20th century. And they helped supervise her PhD dissertation, which was on a very, very interesting subject back in the 1930s. It's a less interesting subject, I think, today. But it was called the Socialist Calculation Debate. And what was this? It was a debate between economists about how does a socialist society function from an economy standpoint? How do you think about how does the economy work in a socialist environment? And she was of the opinion that it could work. And she tried to talk about how in that structure, how an economy could work in a socialist society where everything was equal. And there was very big, vigorous debate on this in the 1920s and 1930s, and her dissertation was really important. It would be cited in Joseph Schumpeter's book, which is a very famous book called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. So what happened to her? She left her position in the university because she was forced to leave when the Nazis assumed power. And she, similar to like Siegfried, who was a lawyer and then did something totally different, she became the principal of an adoption organization for Jewish women in this town of Elberfeld, or also Wuppertal, which is right nearby. And she turned down multiple opportunities to come to the United States. In fact, Joseph Schumpeter, who was then at Harvard, provided an affidavit for her. And she still decided she wanted to help those women with adopting children, and she wanted to stay. So she was very, very noble. So, and I just mentioned about how she was sent to the Minsk ghetto in November of 1941, and she perished in 1942 or 1943. There is a Stapelstein in Wuppertal, in their main market, that bears her name. And it says how she was deported in 1941. So again, I didn't know anything about her. I don't know if anyone knew about her before today, but I only learned about her as part of the research. So now we're going to go on to the seventh child out of 9 surviving children. This is Wilhelm. He was born Wolf. That was his name. And he was the only child that remained in Tarnów his whole life. And this actually is a picture that we have of him from 1930 as an older man, middle-aged man. And he had 2 daughters, Maria and Erna. And both, while he died in the Shoah in the Tarnów ghetto in 1942, both of his daughters were able to leave Tarnów and left and survived. And so there are surviving family from both of his daughters. Maria married a man named Joseph Bluebaum, and they immigrated to Palestine in the 1930s, and they have descendants living in Israel, and they're very Israeli. I have tried to connect with those descendants and have not been successful thus far, but I know about them. And then they have a younger daughter who married a man named Max Gashk, who changed his name to Garçon, and they moved to Australia. And so, yes, we have Australian cousins who continue to live there today. One of them is the grandson of Wilhelm, Erna's son, Ronald. And, Ronald, was the grandson of Wilhelm. He's no longer alive, but Ronald's sons are. So we're the great-grandchildren of Wilhelm. So he went to Australia. He became a famous professor, too, of philology at the University of Adelaide in Australia. And he has 2 sons today. I've connected with one of them, one who lives in Melbourne, and another one named Derek, who lives in a very rural area along the coastline of Australia, New South Wales, very remote location, probably a 6-hour drive from any big city, and he's living out his life there. So I was able to connect with him, and he was the one who sent me this picture of his father, the professor. And now we'll go on to child number 8, and that is Regina. She was born Rebecca Rubin Gewürz. She married a man also from a man from Tartakov, and then they moved to this town called Chemnitz in Germany, and they had 2 sons, Max and Meta, who was, again, Hebrew name Miriam, named after Miriam Prager Rubin, Moses' wife. Meta and her husband, I know more about them. They immigrated to Palestine, and they were able to bring Regina to Palestine before the war. So Regina and her husband both survived the Shoah by being in Israel and being in Palestine during the war. And Meta's daughter and Regina's granddaughter is Ruth Almog. And so this is the slide about her, who, again, I had the chance to meet earlier this summer, which was really, really special. She is an Israeli novelist, and she, again, is one of the most famous writers of contemporary Hebrew literature. She's won a lot of prestigious awards. And in addition to that, she's been the deputy editor of the literary section of the Haaretz newspaper for over 50 years. She's still involved in the Haaretz newspaper and writes for them. And as I said, she's written about some of the family members, and her knowledge of the family led to connecting so many different branches. Even things that we're going to talk about next week, she knew about a lot of these branches of the family. And it's all thanks to her knowing about this stuff that we were able to find out so much information. So it's been really special to be able to connect with Ruth. She's a really wonderful woman and cares so much about our family. And then we're going to move on to the last child. We're getting close to the end of this very long presentation. His name was Samuel. He was actually named after Miriam Prager's father, who had died just a couple years earlier, whose name was Samuel. But he had this nickname Munia, and he had 2 sons. So he spent some time in Vienna, but he also was in Tarnów too. It's hard to tell exactly when he was in Vienna and when he was in Tarnów, but he had at least 1 son born in Vienna. And he was a merchant, and again, he lived in Vienna and in Tarnów at various times. But during the war, he was in Tarnów, and both he and his wife perished during the Shoah, and along with their son Kurt. But they had 1 son, Hans, who survived. And you can see on this Yad Vashem testimony, this is him writing, Hans, the son, writing in Hebrew that about his family who had died in the Shoah. And for a really long time, I did not know I could not figure out, does he have any descendants? Does Hans have any descendants? Who is he? Can I find him? I know that he lived in Bat Yam because it says that on the form. But I really made an effort to see, can I find a descendant from this family? And I was finally successful. This was not all that long ago, maybe a year ago. I was able to finally connect with a son of Hans, whose name is Daniel, or Danny Rubin. He lives in Israel. He was an electronics engineer, and he has a daughter who is a UX designer. She has a whole really interesting website where you can see some of her work, and his son is a 3D designer for video games. So I was able to connect with him for a short while and learn a little bit about his family, and it was really special. He didn't know much about his Rubin family at all. Their branch sort of got totally disconnected, and so being able to find him and being able to share with him some of this information, I think was meaningful to him and his family. So this is the last slide of the presentation, of the core presentation here. This is just a map of where Moses Rubin's descendants live today, from what I've found so far. There could be others potentially, but obviously our branch of the family is mainly the ones that are all over the United States today, aside from the Klepetar descendant who lives in Los Angeles. And then we have a lot of European family that still live in France, different places in France and in Europe. Obviously, we have a huge contingent in Israel, and then that small branch that live in Australia. So what I have an appendix section where you can see family trees for all the different families. I'll leave that to others to peruse when I send the presentation. But with that, does anyone have any questions? I'm just taking a look through the chat here. Seems like... Oh, Alan has this postcard. I would love to see the postcard. I think I might have that postcard too. Let me stop the screen share for now, and I'm going to also stop the recording just a sec. Let me stop the recording.